I'm going to take you through one of the games in the match between Magnus Carlsen and Vasil Ivanchuk that was played in the Chess Legends online tournament. What an extraordinary match this was. It went to an Armageddon. But I'm going to take you through the third rapid game, which I thought was, the most interesting of them all, actually. So going into this game, Carlsen was already one down in the match. So, with just 2 games to go, he really needed to hit back. And he played a very orthodox opening, playing d4 and c4 and knight f3. Ivanchuk played the Bogo Indian. And instead of bishop d2, which can lead to exchanges, maybe a more simplified position, Carlsen kept more tension with knight d2. Castles from Ivanchuk, a3. Now, Ivanchuk didn't give up the bishop pair with bishop takes knight. He put the bishop back on e7, which looks really passive. But there's more to this than meets the eye, because in fact, that knight isn't very well placed on d2. Now, the old way of playing this was to go d5 here. I've actually played that in the past, but Ivanchuk kept more tension with d6. This is the modern way of playing the position. And bishop e2, and here, you can play for e5 or c5. Ivanchuk played knight fd7. Usually aiming for this move, and Carlsen decided to reroute this knight, which isn't on the best square. He played knight b1. It looks like very strange toing and froing with first of all this bishop, and now the knight, but the knight wants to come back to the square it really belongs, c3. And here previously e5 has been played before, which looks pretty normal, setting up this kind of pawn chain, but instead Ivanchuk played d5, so this is really confusing. According to where the pieces stand, the structure changes, but d5 is a really interesting move. So here, if white exchanges and plays e5, as in other variations, then black can hit out straight away with c5. That's really interesting. And black hasn't had to waste time moving the knight back. This knight is already hitting e5, so black will get very quick pressure on these pawns here. So after d5, Carlsen just put the knight on c3. And pawns exchanged on e4. And now knight f6. So this is looking more like a French Rubinstein variation, or some variations of the Carlsen. Queen c2, defending the knight on e4. Knight d7. Knights exchanged on f6, and castles. Well, it's quite clear that white has some advantage here. Typical space advantage with these kind of positions. And rook d1 is a nice move, because that makes it much harder for black to break free with c5. But black is solid enough, having exchanged those pair of knights, then that gives black a little bit more room, and the bishop is on the long diagonal, a good diagonal. b4 from Carlsen, but white has a nice space advantage here. I think Carlsen would have been pretty happy with the way things had turned out. Bishop e4 knocks the queen away from an important diagonal, and now queen c8. So this is interesting that Ivanchuk would like to put the queen on b7, and that'll connect the rooks, very important. But after knight e5, then black doesn't have time to go queen b7, because then pawn to f3, and that bishop will be chased down. It'll have to go eventually to one of these squares, and white will be able to nab that bishop. so things aren't so clear. So after knight e5, knight d7, Ivanchuk trying to trade pieces, looks very sensible. The knight, of course, is very strong on e5. Queen e3, attacking the bishop, which came back to b7. Now, if knights are exchanged, then that's not too bad for black. So Carlsen just drops the knight back to f3, very sensible. Declining to exchange, and that means with more minor pieces on the board, black is rather congested. And you can see that white still has this wonderful center. Bishop f6, bishop b2 from Carlsen. Rook d8, and now rook d2. Now, the break that black really wants here is pawn to c5 to hit out at the pawn on d4. But let's just have a quick look at what might happen. White would exchange, bishop exchanged on b2, and now here, well, there's actually no need to push. Instead, white would play rook d1 with the kind of threat of doubling on the d file. And you can see that white is just really well coordinated here. Queen stands really well on e3, and that's not a simple position for black to play. So the natural move c5 isn't really great here. So Ivanchuk had to play passively with knight f8. Now, I think simply rook d1 is a good move for white here, just bolstering the center. But, well, we know Magnus, he's usually in a hurry. He played h4. Wants to press on the king side straight away, and that's directed against this knight move, knight g6. He pushed on with h5. But things are a little bit complicated now with the knight spinning back to e7, looking to come into f5. And you can see that now there's going to be some pressure on the pawn on d4, particularly with that bishop on the long diagonal as well. Now, it's possible to play bishop d3 to perhaps knock out that knight when it comes to f5. But Carlsen, again, you know, it's his way is to press forward as quickly as possible. d5. So that opens up this diagonal, bishop exchange. And you can see that pawn takes pawn isn't possible because the queen will attack the knight. Or the queen can take the knight. So knight f5, queen f4. White's piece is still very nicely placed, but he's giving up a pawn. And Carlsen knocks that knight back, and the bishop comes to an excellent diagonal. So the knight comes to h6, not a beautiful place for the knight at all. But that was probably necessary to guard f7. If it had gone back this way, then it looks to me like, yeah, knight g5 would be incredibly strong. Let's just have a quick look at that. Knight g5 attacking f7, attacking h7 doesn't look good. So knight h6 defends f7, but it's a really passive square for the knight. But Ivanchuk at least has a pawn for this position. Carlsen played c5, closing the bishop. And, well, d4 is possible, but probably that would just be taken. So after c5, Ivanchuk exchanged pawns. And he needs to do something about this bishop. He played bishop a6. And now I would have thought that just dropping back the bishop here should be the right move to keep that knight under control. Also still looking through to h7 as well. But Carlsen had another idea in mind. He exchanged on a6 and then played knight d4. So he hasn't kind of wasted any time. he wanted to make sure that d pawn was blocked. That's important. That knight is still very poorly placed. I mean, you just compare the two pieces. So it's all about control. Typical Carlsen. I guess the downside is that this queen comes into action, and that can create pretty serious counterplay. Rook e8 from Ivanchuk. Well, yeah, he would love to play the rook into e4. So f3 by Carlsen. Well, in rapid play chess, that's the kind of move you make automatically. Knight b5 might have been very strong, though, coming in there. But thing is, it's very hard in rapid play to sort of calculate the consequences of moves like this and what's going on here. White is probably better, though. Yeah, f3, it's all about containment. When you don't have that much time on the clock, f3 contains black's pieces. c6 played. That was en prise. King h2. Yeah, the king was a little bit exposed, so it just comes over to the h file. Rook ac8 protects that pawn and means that the queen is free for duties. Rook b3. Well, controls the d3 square, prevents that queen coming in, but queen a5, looking at the pawn, looking down this diagonal. Rook c1 protects the pawn. f6. And now, finally, Carlsen gets to activate this rook, particularly after f6 has been played. Now, Ivanchuk wanted to do that to bring the rook up the board, but he does expose the 7th rank. Watch out for that. Rook b7. So this is potentially quite nasty, but it's a fascinating position because after rook e5, I mean, I was watching this live. I thought, this looks so strong for black. This rook looks at the h-pawn. Potentially, it can swing to g5 to protect the g7 pawn as well. So it felt as though Ivanchuk was right back in the game now. Also blocks out white's queen too along this diagonal. So this was tough. And, if Carlsen defends the h-pawn by playing g4, then it's white's king that looks exposed. Black could nab that pawn. Feels, very exposed here. So after rook e5 threatening the h-pawn, Carlsen nudged to the side with queen h4, but really the queen doesn't want to be on h4, doesn't want to be consigned to the menial duty of protecting that h-pawn. And here, maybe queen takes pawn. That queen hits lots of pieces. Well, I mean, white would still have compensation here, but, it's very much in the balance. But after queen h4, Ivanchuk played queen d2, which also looks like a pretty strong move, hassling the rook, looking at the knight, looking in this direction as well, looking here. Rook c2 attacks the queen. Queen d3, the black queen now in the thick of it. This looked really difficult for white to control, but after this move, rook b2, suddenly you realised, well, black has to take great care. Potential pressure on the 7th rank. Maybe rook b8. Attacking along the 8th rank as well. Really tough position. So, I mean, let me just give you an illustration of the kind of danger that black is in here. So, for example, knight f7 looks like a very natural move to bring that knight back into play, but then rook takes knight. Rook b7 check. And, well, if the king steps back, then we've got queen g4 hitting the rook, hitting g7. So if rook e7, then takes, and queen g4 is actually a winning move. Attacking the rook, attacking g7, potentially coming into e6 with check, and the queen and knight, actually that gives white a winning attack. So really tough position. Ivanchuk played knight f5, and here actually queen g4 again is a very strong move, but Carlsen exchanged. Both players really short of time now, and h6 feels very natural to break things open. Ivanchuk should take that pawn now, and he's probably holding. White has enough compensation. Instead, Ivanchuk played g5. Rook g7 check. King f8 should probably be played here, but white is certainly better. King h8 played. Queen g4. This is excellent judgment from Carlsen. He realizes that even after the exchange of queens, white stands better here. Well, not just better, but winning position, because he's conquered the 7th rank, and that pawn on h6 will be decisive. Actually, that will give white a decisive attack. So let's come back here. Queen g4, brilliant move from Carlsen. Queen f4 check from Ivanchuk. See, that's clever. He's hoping that Carlsen will exchange, and then a rook check, and then he'll be able to take that pawn on h6. But no, after queen f4 check, Carlsen played g3. Good move. So Ivanchuk had to exchange now. Remember, that rook is on. So Ivanchuk exchanged. And now, well, let me just show you what the real threat is here. If d4, then white doubles on the 7th. You take here. Now, this is a very well-known mating pattern. White uses the pawn on h6, and rook h8 is mate. That's why it's so dangerous having the pawn on h6. Ivanchuk struggled hard. He played rook g8. Carlsen took on a7, and here, well, Ivanchuk kind of resigned. Or did he lose on time? It looked very close to me. I think he actually resigned just before he lost on time, but it is a hopeless position. The best that black can play here is to bring the rook back to e8. Remember, the threat is to play here with a mating attack. Black can struggle on with this move, rook b7 and rook g6. Meaning after rook takes h7, the king comes to g8, and you can see the rook covers here. But this is losing. Black is just so tied up here. White advances the a-pawn, king g2. I'll show you why that's important in a second. d2, and now the rook comes across here. Rook takes h6. You see, it's not check because the king is on g2. That is the point. And rook takes d2, and this is a winning endgame for white. Dominating the 7th, and this pawn is going to advance, and yeah, this is a winning position. Of course, black can do something like this, but this is a completely winning endgame with that pawn advancing all the way to the 7th rank. Wow, what a struggle. I thought that was a fascinating game because round about this point, you know, it wasn't absolutely clear to me that Carlsen had enough compensation, but he proved he did. And I think, you know, the attack on the B file was, well, decisive in the end for Carlsen, but really that this game was really in the balance. Well, after this, the 4th rapid play game was a draw. They went into an Armageddon, which Carlsen won by the skin of his teeth. Basically, Ivanchuk ran out of time, and Carlsen tricked him. But some fascinating encounters in that match, and well, Ivanchuk showed that, you know, he could really be a match for Carlsen, and you know, what an amazing player he still is. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us on PayPal or Patreon. links down there. Thanks for watching.